Hello friends, today we are going to derive the offer curve or reciprocal demand curve, which is extensively used in the discussion in international economics. We will first explain the theory associated with it, namely the reciprocal demand theory, and will analyze the derivation of offer curve. Welcome to the session. The concept of reciprocal demand theory owes its origin to the works of John Stuart Mill in his J.S. Mill. In his 1848 work, The Principle of Political Economy. Basically, J.S. Mill's theory of reciprocal demand is a follow-up of the earlier version, namely the Ricardian comparative advantage doctrine. We have seen earlier that in our traditional trade theories, the principle of comparative advantage, even though asserts the possibility of trade, even when one country is having absolute advantage in all lines of production, it did not explain what is the price ratio at which the two countries trade, or what are the terms at which the two countries trade, and what are the relative price at which the two countries trade. Hope that you remember those sessions where we elaborated the celebrated example of Portugal and England in the Ricardian analysis. I will be putting the link of the traditional theory in our description box. In fact, J.S. Mill tried to extend the comparative advantage model by explaining the relative price at which the two countries trade. And he introduced the concept of reciprocal demand to determine the relative price. Relative price, we have already seen that in the international trade, relative price refers to the terms of trade. And in our session on terms of trade, we found that terms of trade is the crucial determinant that influence the gains from international trade. So the topic or the reciprocal demand theory is very important because it explains how terms of trade are determined, how the price ratios are determined, and ultimately what will be the gains for individual countries from international trade. This constituted the base for the subsequent analysis with respect to the gains and the terms of trade in international economics. Now, what is terms of trade? And in fact, what is the reciprocal demand? Mill pointed out that reciprocal demand in international trade refers to the intensity of each other's demand. In other words, it signifies the amount or the quantity of one commodity which you are willing to give up for acquiring some quantity of some other commodity. Or in other words, it refers to your demand for foreign countries' products and their demand for our country's product. So there is a mutual demand, there is each other's demand, and it essentially results in the determination of the price ratio and the relative price and ultimately the terms of trade in international trade. To elaborate this concept, we will first explain some of the assumptions of the model, and these assumptions are very similar to those introduced by David Ricardo in his comparative advantage doctrine. Now, let us explore the assumptions of the model. The first assumption is that this is a 2-by-2 model. 2-by-2 in the sense that it assumes that there are two countries. In John Stuart Mill example, he cited the case of Germany and England. They tried to produce two commodities, namely linen and cloth. So it's a two-country, two-commodity example, and the only factor of production which is used in the production of these two commodities is labor. Like the neoclass or the classical theories of trade, this is a labor theory of value, where labor is assumed as the only factor of production. Now, very similar to that of Ricardo, because in his celebrated example, Ricardo introduced the case of two countries. It was Portugal and England. Two commodities, it was wine and cloth. Very similar to the Ricardian analysis. This is the first assumption. And the second assumption is that there is the prevalence of constant returns to scale. Again, the third assumption is that the taste and preferences of the countries are similar. We have the assumption of perfect competition in the commodity market of linen and cloth. We have the fifth assumption. There is the assumption of perfect competition. The tastes are assumed to be similar. Taste and preferences of the consumers in the two countries are similar. And we have the case of free trade with no transportation cost. And finally, the assumption of the prevalence of comparative advantage, or comparative advantage principle determines the trade between two countries, Germany and England. So these are the assumptions of the model. So what are the assumptions? It's a 2x2 model in which he analyzes the case of two countries, Germany and England. They try to produce two commodities, linen and cloth. Labor is the only factor of production. We have the assumption of constant return to scale. We have the assumption of same taste, same preferences in two countries. We have the assumption of perfectly competitive market. The taste and preferences of the consumers are assumed to be similar. We have a free trade, including there is no transportation cost. And finally, the comparative advantage principles governs international trade between the two countries. Now, we can explain the case of this two commodity model of Ricardo. So we have two countries, Germany and England, and they are trying to produce two commodities, linen and cloth. Now let us say we have two commodity example, and we are looking to in the case of quantities of commodity produced with the only factor of production, which is labor. Let us assume that the Germany produces say 10 units of linen and cloth with their labor supply, or the productivity of the labor is 10 linen and 10 cloth in Germany, and we have the case of England, which is say 6 and 8. You can see that Germany do have an advantage in the production of both commodities. Using the Smithian terminology, Germany do have an absolute advantage in the production of both linen and cloth. Shifting our focus to the comparative doctrine, because it is assumed that the comparative principle is underlying the trade pattern or determines the trade pattern between two countries in the theory of reciprocal demand of John Stuart Mill. England do have a disadvantage in the production of both commodities, but its disadvantage is smaller in the case of cloth. So, as far as the comparative doctrine is concerned, Germany will specialize in the production of linen and England will specialize in the production of cloth. According to the Ricardian principle, the better of country should specialize where its advantage is greater. Where its advantage is greater, Germany will specialize in the production of linen. The disadvantaged country should specialize where its disadvantage is smaller. England will specialize in the production of cloth. In fact, the comparative advantage ends here. J.S. Mill take up this issue to explain what will be the relative price at which these two countries will trade, or what in fact determines the price ratio between linen and cloth between these countries. That means the Germany, which is exporting linen and importing cloth, what will be the relative price? What will be the terms at which these two countries trade? England, which export commodity cloth, what will be the prices of export and import? Now, Jasmine points out that it crucially depends upon your intensity of demand. Intensity of domestic demand to foreign goods and foreign demand for domestic goods. Or it crucially depends upon your demand for foreigners' commodities and foreigners' demand for your commodities. If your demand is more intense, that means your demand for foreigners' products is more intense, terms of trade can act against you. On the other hand, if foreigners' demand for our products is more intense and inelastic, then terms of trade can be favorable to us. As we have said, the terms of trade and the relative price depends upon how much quantity of commodity that you are willing to give up for the purchase of quantities from abroad, for the purchase of quantities from other countries. This is the basic premise of the reciprocal demand, intensity of each other's demand. Mill points out that this intensity will be determined by the domestic exchange rate between these two countries, or domestic ratio at which these two countries do have domestically. So, how these two commodities are exchanged in the domestic market depends, or in fact influences, the decision with respect to the terms of trade. Now, let us explain what is in fact the domestic ratio at which these two commodities are exchanged in both countries. Now, we have, let us say, a domestic exchange ratio. In Germany, the domestic exchange rate between linen and cloth is 1:1. 10 with respect to 10. As far as England is concerned, it is 1:1.33, because it is 6 and 8. 8 divided by 6 is 1.33. So this is the domestic exchange ratio between two commodities in our two country example, in Germany as well as England. So this domestic exchange ratio crucially influences the determination of the terms of trade when these two countries enter into trade. Now we know that Germany will specialize in the production of linen and England will specialize in the production of cloth, and we have already computed the domestic exchange ratio. Mill pointed out that this domestic exchange ratio, which is determined by the productivity of labor or relative productivity of labor in these two countries. So, this domestic exchange ratio, along with the intensity of domestic demand to foreign goods, influences the pattern of trade, influences the price ratio, influences the terms of trade, influences the relative price. Now, let us take the case of one country at one time, and we will be focusing on Germany. Germany is a country. Germany export linen and import cloth. If the demand of Germany for the cloth import of England, remember, Germany is exporting linen and importing cloth. So, terms of trade will be influenced by intensity of Germany's demand to cloth, which is produced and exported by England. If the intensity of Germany's demand to cloth is more intense, or we can call it as it is more inelastic. It is more intense. Demand for England's cloth is more inelastic or more intense, more severe, then the exchange ratio between linen and cloth will be approximately 1:1, and it will be favorable to England. And on the other hand, if the demand for England's cloth as far as Germany is concerned is less intense or more elastic, then the exchange rate between, or the price ratio between linen and cloth will be 1:1.33, or essentially the price ratio or the exchange rate, or what we have the terms of trade, will lie between 1 to 1.33. If it is Germany's demand is more intense, it will be 1:1, or that means for each linen exported, Germany will receive only 1 unit of cloth. Understood? If Germany's demand for England's cloth is less intense or more elastic, less severe, then it will receive, for each unit of linen exported, it will receive 1.33 units of cloth from England. So if as terms of trade approximate towards 1.33 cloth for each unit of linen, it will be favorable for Germany. On the other hand, if terms of trade move towards 1:1 or 1 linen for 1 cloth, then it will be favorable for other country, namely England. So this is the principle, this is the essence of the reciprocal demand. Reciprocal demand says that the price ratio at which the two countries trade, the relative terms at which the two countries trade, the relative price at which the two countries trade depends upon the intensity of interacting demand, each other's demand. One country's demand for the other product, the other country's demand for the other country's product, each other's demand, our demand for foreign country's product and foreigners' demand for our country's product, demand for export as well as the demand for import as well. This in fact is determined by, according to Mill, this is in fact determined by the domestic exchange ratio. So this domestic exchange ratio is influenced by the productivity of labor in your country. So the pattern is clear, I hope. That is, the productivity of labor determines the exchange ratio. This exchange ratio, along with your intensity of demand, influences your terms of trade, influences the price ratio, influences the rate at which you trade. So this is the base of the reciprocal demand theory. Now we will shift our focus from reciprocal demand theory to its graphical representation, popularly called, as we said, the offer curve. The offer curve, otherwise called the reciprocal demand curve, was introduced into economics by the two economists, namely Alfred Marshall and Edgeworth. So Marshall and Edgeworth introduced, or in fact popularized, the concept called, or the analytical tool which is often used in international trade, known as the offer curve or reciprocal demand curve. In fact, as we have seen, the principle or the theory of reciprocal demand was verbalized by John Stuart Mill himself way back in 1848. Later, Marshall and Edgeworth provided a graphic form for these terms of trade curve or the reciprocal demand curve that ultimately result in the popularization of what is known as the offer curve. So what is offer curve? Offer curve indicates the quantities of export and import that a country is willing to trade at various possible relative prices. Once more, offer curve indicates the willingness of a country to export and import, or in general to trade, at various possible relative prices. We have already seen from our session on terms of trade that relative price is nothing but the terms of trade. So, modifying our definition, offer curve indicates the quantity of export and import, the quantity of export and import that a country is willing to trade, may not be the actual trade, willing to export and import at various possible relative prices. This relative price is nothing but the terms of trade. I'll be putting the link for terms of trade in our description box as well, because understand the two concepts, namely the comparative advantage doctrine. It is essential for have a clear knowledge of the earlier version reciprocal demand theory, and terms of trade is crucial when we talk about the offer curve analysis. Now, moving back to our definition, offer curve indicates is a curve that shows the quantity of export and import that a country is willing at various possible relative prices, at various possible terms of trade. So it shows, like in the principle of reciprocal demand, it shows our willingness to export. It shows our willingness to import. It basically shows the different relative price the country finds acceptable to trade. It preferences to trade. So basically offer curve consists of two curves, namely a demand curve and a supply curve. Demand curve in the sense that it includes the demand for our imports. It includes demand for our import, the supply of our exports. On the contrary, it demands for our products to foreign country or foreign country citizen as far as country is concerned, the supply of our exports. So it includes both demand for foreigners' products as well as supply of our products. So the advantage of offer curve is that it shows graphically, at least graphically, how an equilibrium terms of trade is determined. How, as following the analysis of the reciprocal demand theory of J.S. Mill, how the intensity of domestic demand to foreign products, how the intensity of foreign demands to domestic product determines graphically the equilibrium terms of trade. So the offer curve is most often used in the determination of an equilibrium terms of trade. And we saw that terms of trade is a crucial determinant that influences the pattern of the distribution of gains from trade. So offer curve graphically shows how an equilibrium terms of trade is determined. Now let us examine or let us derive what is known as the offer. There are a number of methods of deriving an offer curve. We can use the production possibility frontier or production possibility curve of a country. We can draw from an indifference map along with the PPC, or you can have a different kind of relative prices or arbitrary determined relative price ratios or relative terms of trade, and you can graphically present the offer curve. There will be two axes, and we will be following this last method where we will arbitrarily fix the terms of trade of one country. Let us say country 1. Country 1 in the Heckscher-Ohlin framework. Country 1, which is a labor abundant country, export commodity X and import commodity Y. We will take the specific case of this country 1 and we will try to draw an offer curve by looking its willingness to export and import, to export commodity X and import commodity Y. And we will graphically show how the offer curve is determined. We will be looking at this kind of this tabular approach by analyzing arbitrarily determine the terms of trade. In one axis, we will draw the quantity exported. In other axis, we will draw the quantity imported as well. Now let us analyze the case of this country which is exporting commodity X and importing commodity Y. Let us assume that this country's terms of trade is determined according to this. So we are going to see some kind of an arbitrary price ratios or an arbitrary terms of trade at which our country 1 is going to trade. We know that country 1 is a labor abundant country specializing in the production and export of commodity X. And we are going to see the terms at which the country trade or the country one trade, the terms at which the country find acceptable to trade. Now let us fix some arbitrary values. Let us assume that this country exports say 25x for 5y. We have a terms of trade where 5:1, or the px by py is equal to px by py is 1/5. Price of x divided by price of y, which is nothing but the terms of trade, relative price. Then this country trades we have 40x and 10y. We have a 4:1 ratio or 1/4. Then say 60x 20y, 3:1 or 1/3. The rate at which, the ratio at which, the price ratio at which x and y are traded. I will elaborate. Then let us say we have an 80x 40y case where it is 2:1, 1/2. Finally 100x 100y, price ratio 1:1 or terms of trade 1/1. Purely arbitrary in the sense that initially this country which is specializing in the production of commodity X do not have much commodity Y at their disposal, so it is placing very high value for Y. That is, this country is willing to give up. This country 1 is willing to give up 5 units of X for an additional unit of Y. 5:1. Then as we move along our column on terms of trade or relative price or price ratio, whatever you call, you can see that there is a reduction. Initially it is willing to give up 5x for 1y, then 4x for 1y, 3x for 1y, 2x for 1y, 1x for 1y. So we can argue that this is basically results from the diminishing marginal utility of imports, because to start with, this country intensity or the elasticity for demand for commodity Y which is exported by our country too is very intense. He is highly inelastic. That's why this country is willing to give up 5 units of X for an additional unit of 1Y. As the quantity of Y increases, this country is willing to give up lesser and lesser quantity of commodity X for an additional unit of commodity Y. So, when we transform these numbers into a graph, where in this graph at one axis we will draw the quantity exported, which is commodity X, and the other axis we will draw the quantity imported, commodity Y. We will get the offer curve of country 1. So this table will be translated into a graph. Hope the point is clear, because it shows countries' willingness to trade, willingness to export, willingness to import. It shows different ratios at which the country find acceptable to trade. Country is willing to trade. It shows the quantity willing to export as well as willing to import. That's why we have already said that offer curve is a combination of two curves, demand curve as well as supply curve. Our demand for foreigners product and foreigners demand for our products, and following the principle of the reciprocal demand theory, the intensity of domestic demand for foreign goods and foreign demand for domestic good ultimately determines the terms of trade, and these terms of trade are graphically represented through using an offer curve. And the advantage of offer curve is that it shows how an equilibrium terms of trade is determined, how the interaction of demand and supply determines an equilibrium terms of trade. Now we will transform, we will draw the curve, using these ratios or these quantities rather, and we'll explain the details of the offer curve and what will happen when there is a shifts in the offer curve as well. So we have put commodity X in our horizontal axis and commodity Y on our vertical axis, and we know that we are trying to draw the offer curve of country 1, and for country 1 commodity X is its export good and commodity Y is its import good. And now we will pick those terms of trade points or those quantities of export and import which our country 1 find it acceptable to trade, its offers, and we have the initial situation in which 25x is exported for each 5 unit of Y. Then we have a situation of 40-10. Then we have a situation of 60-20, 60x for 20Y. We have a situation of 80-40, 80x for 40Y, and finally we do have a situation of or a case where 100x is exported for 100 unit of Y. So this is 5:1, 4:1, 3:1, 2:1, 1:1, or our price ratio Px by Py 1/5, 1/4, 1/3, 1/2 and 1/1. When we join all these terms of trade points using a continuous line, we will get a line like this. This is nothing but the offer curve of country 1. This is the offer curve of country 1. It shows different terms of trade. It shows different terms of trade this country find acceptable to trade. All these are the terms of trade points. One thing you can be observed, that means our offer curve or the offer curve of country 1 bulges towards the axis, one particular axis. It bulges towards the axis which measures commodity X. Commodity X is this country's exportable commodity or export good. So it may be noted that when we draw an offer curve of any country, it will have a bulginess. It will bulge towards the axis which measures the country's export good. Similarly, if we follow the same principle, if we draw the offer curve of country 2, we will get the offer curve of country 2 like this. It will bulge towards the y-axis. Y-axis measures the country 2's export good or commodity Y. So this is how an equilibrium terms of trade is determined under the offer curve analysis or using offer curve. And the novelty of offer curve is that it graphically shows how an equilibrium terms of trade is determined, how an equilibrium relative prices are determined among the trade between two countries. It will be more interesting when we look what happens to the terms of trade when there are shifts in the offer curve. Now we will explore or we will wind up our session by looking at the shifts in the offer curve. So we have offer curve of two countries. Country 1's offer curve which bulges towards the commodity X. Country 1's export commodity is commodity X, and we have the offer curve of country 2 which bulges towards the vertical axis which measures commodity Y. Now the interesting case will be what happens when there are shifts in the offer curve. Now let us assume that the country 1's offer curve shifts towards the right. Let us have another point. At this point, this country 1 is let us put it like this. This country is exporting OX1 quantity of commodity X in return for OY1 quantity of commodity Y. So this is the situation. This country is exporting OX1 of commodity X in return for OY1 of commodity Y. Now, let us explore the case what happens when there is a shift in the offer curve of country 1. This is the new offer curve. Let us put it as, say, I star. What happens at this point, at the new point, let us say this point as E, this is as E star. At this new point, this country is exporting a larger quantity of commodity X. It is exporting a larger quantity of commodity X, but it is receiving a lesser quantity of commodity Y. That is, even after exporting a greater quantity than before, a higher quantity than before, now it is receiving a lesser quantity of its import. In other words, terms of trade has turned against this country 1. When there is a shift in the offer curve towards the right as far as country 1 is concerned, the opposite will happen. That means there is a deterioration in the terms of trade, there is a decline in the terms of trade when there is a rightward shift in the offer curve of country 1. There is a shift towards its export axis. On the other hand, if the opposite is true, if there is another shift of the country 1's offer curve, something say like this. If country 1's offer curve shift towards this point, rather than moving here, it moves towards says I0. What happens? That means this country, when there is a leftward shift with respect to the country 1, this country, even after exporting a lesser quantity than before, it is getting a greater quantity of commodity Y. Quantity exported had declined, but quantity imported with those of export quantity has increased. Or in other words, there is an improvement in the terms of trade. So when there are shifts in the terms of trade, we were taking the specific case of country 1. When there is a rightward shift, or more precisely, there is a shift towards the axis that measures country's export good, terms of trade will deteriorate. If there is a shift towards the axis that measures country's imports, there will be an improvement in the terms of trade. That is as far as the shifts in the terms of trade. The same things happen when there is a shift in the terms of trade or the offer curve of country 2 as well. So we saw how terms of trade can improve, terms of trade can deteriorate when there are shifts in the offer curve of the countries. So that's all as far as the offer curve is concerned. Offer curve, as we saw, it's a very simple concept. It's a combination of demand curve and supply curve. Demand for foreigners' products, supply of our products. So it's a demand curve as well as supply curve, and ultimately the price ratio following the reciprocal demand theory, it determines by the concept of reciprocal demand or intensity of each other's demand, and offer curve shows willingness of a country at various possible relative prices, willingness of a country to trade at various possible relative prices, willingness of a country to trade at various possible terms of trade, and offer curve shows how graphically a terms of trade can be determined, how equilibrium terms, we have different points of equilibrium like E0, E star, how these equilibrium terms of trade are determined graphically using an offer curve. To sum up, one economist has said, offer curve is often resemble a clock, because which is very simple, but inside a clock there is a complex mechanism. That's an offer curve. Offer curve intuitively is a very simple thing, but there is a very complex mechanism under it. Hope that this session is useful to you. So until we meet next time, stay safe, happy learning. Thank you.